Chapter 6 TBI. My brain had stopped swelling. It remained swollen, but at least it wasn't getting any worse. My parents and Alan were finally told the extent of my injuries. My brain had taken the full force of decelerating from 30 miles per hour to a standstill in a split second, causing the frontal lobes of my brain to bang on the front of my skull. That impact was what had caused the initial swelling. My brain had rattled around inside like a pea in a whistle. Although the inside of the skull has some sharp protrusions, thankfully none had penetrated the brain itself. It had rubbed up against the side of the skull, though, scuffing the areas of the brain that dealt with emotions. At this point, Professor Ruston paused before saying, "Kevin will be quite different when he wakes up." My family were more interested in when I would wake up, but the professor explained he couldn't say, but that the longer I slept, the better, as it gave my brain more time to recover. Nan, ever the matron, had decreed that she should visit me in hospital, and if my dad didn't pick her up, she would get the bus. This was no idle threat, and to ensure my dual walking, stick wielding grandmother didn't carry out a threat, Dad and Alan got in the cab and went to pick her up. As Dad drove back to the hospital, Alan suggested that we get the traditional hospital gift for me, a bunch of grapes, in case I woke up and was hungry. They arrived back in the ward. Nan had been fully briefed by Dad and Alan on my condition. She made a beeline for my bed and sat down next to me, talking to me. Her words rang around the ward, but were unheeded by me. I just lay there unconscious and unresponsive. I lay there still and unmoving as family and friends came to visit and talk to me. Doctors carried out various tests, but could give my family no further information about when I might possibly wake or how I would be. This was my second day of unconsciousness, and the doctor said that moved me into a different category of head injury. Because I had been unconscious for more than 24 hours, I was now categorised as severe traumatic brain injury. The statistics that go with that classification are sobering. My future life could be seriously impaired. Of the 6,650 people in the UK who annually receive a severe traumatic brain injury, 60% never return to work. Thankfully, my parents were not made aware of this fact at the time. That would have been even more worried about my future. Alan took the week off work. He stayed with me every night, just talking to me or watching films on the hospital television. He knew why I had to make the trip to Daytona to collect the money and felt that he should challenge my friend about it. He put off returning the money a couple of times, and Alan felt that he shouldn't be put off repaying the money once more. But at the same time, he didn't want to worry my parents about it and put any other further strain on them, so he just sat down with me and talked. During the day, my parents would visit Alan, would stay during the night, and at lunchtime they would spend some time with me and update them about my status. My parents and Alan would normally have lunch together, and this would give the nurses the time to wash me and change the bed linens. This day, Nan had come along with Mum and Dad. She and Alan talked about the snooker championships. My Nan was convinced that the modern players were unprofessional and that it had been better in her day. They finished lunch and returned to the ward, ready to sit down and talk to me, as the nurses would have finished washing me then. The curtains around my bed were still closed, and some nurses nearby were talking about me. The fear that I had died while they'd gone to get lunch gripped them. Mum and Dad ran across to the bed and pulled the curtains open. 4 doctors were talking to me and my eyes were open. I was alive. My parents started to say things, everything they wanted to say to him, wanted me to hear since the accident, but I did not respond. The nurse ran over to ask them to step away to give the doctors room to work. She also explained that although I had woken up, I hadn't moved. The thoughts of paralysis and brain damage ran through my parents' minds. The intensive care unit of any hospital is a busy place. My parents had to wait outside the ward while the doctors finished their tests. My parents had never been so glad about the creation of mobile phones. They took the time to make some calls to friends and family, tell them I'd finally woken. My nan was convinced that God and my late grandfather were watching over me, her faith in them never wavering. After what must have seemed like the longest time ever, but what in reality must have been no more than a few minutes, a nurse came to speak to them. She explained that a doctor would speak to them before they could see me. A few moments passed and then the doctors arrived. "Kevin is conscious. He came around 2 minutes ago," she stated. but he cannot register anything on his left-hand side. This will change. It's just that the brain is still severely swollen. Can we see him? Asked my mum. Yes. Please only stay for a minute though, came the reply. He needs his rest. To introduce the number of people at my bedside and avoid overstimulating me, Alan and my nan stayed back to let my parents spend a minute with me. Mum and Dad walked to the right-hand side of the bed I was sitting propped up and looked forward with a blank gaze, like a daydreamer. My eyelids began to droop, but my mum moved and my eyes flickered towards her and Dad. Dad moved a bit closer and my eyes tracked his movement before I fell asleep. Later, Mum said that my gaze was like a dead man's stare. As they moved away from my bed, a nurse approached them and asked them to have a quiet word. She explained that because I'd regained consciousness, I would be moved from intensive care to a high dependency unit. Mum and Dad were relieved, as it was the next step in my recovery. They thanked the nurse and then went to update Nan and Alan. My sister Jenny lived next door to us with her daughters Montana and Savannah. As Dad pulled the cab into the drive, Montana ran outside shouting, "Uncle's awake, isn't he? Uncle's awake." They could hear my sister shouting, "Montana, Montana," calling her indoors, knowing full well that Mum and Dad would be over with more details when they were ready. My parents, Nan and Alan, trooped indoors for a cup of tea. Nan looked at Mum and asked, "What's wrong? You've been very quiet since we left hospital. What's the boy like?" Mum knew that Nan was hinting at me being brain damaged, but couldn't acknowledge it. She just said, "I thought we lost him." Nan just hugged Mum close, and for the first time since my accident, Mum allowed herself time to cry. Alan finished his drink and took his leave. He needed to let his parents know what had happened, and I think he realised that as close as he was to us all, my family just needed some time together. Mum, Dad and Nan sat up late into the night discussing what they knew about the accident, pieces they'd gleaned from police and doctors. They couldn't understand how I'd been so severely injured, but there was no real visible wounds or bruises, except a little cut on my ankle. After numerous cups of tea and hours of talking, Dad drove Nan home. When he got back home, he and my mum spoke some more. My mum was terrified that I didn't recognise her and wondered if I ever would. All my dad could say was to take each day at a time. The next morning was a bright one. Mum and Dad heard the dustman's van outside and Ozzy's distinctly yelling at my sister, "Tell Kevin to hurry up and get out." Subtly had never been his strong point, but hearing that made my parents laugh, something they hadn't done in over a week. Once again, my parents made their way to the hospital in Dad's cab. My mum nervously chain-smoked for the entire trip. She was still worried in case I'd forgotten who she was. Dad focused on how supportive the rest of the family and friends had been. Although the route to the hospital was a familiar one, this time their final destination was different. I had been judged well enough to leave intensive care for the high dependency unit.